this topic is extremely important to pretty much everything we're trying to do. When I was listening to all the presentations, I really have to say it's pretty much at the heart of our entire project. So, the first book was referenced. Now we're working together with Francis here on a new book, which this is the cover of, and that immediately drills home this idea that the edgeless city is at the heart of all our thinking on when it comes to urban planning. So in that sense, maybe I'm the odd one out and can be a bit of a breath mint, if you will, because we are practicing planners that felt a necessity coming to China and kind of confronted with a really radical new environment to zoom out, literally, and try and understand this really alien setting that we have to work in, with very different forces at play, and increasingly came to the conclusion that really nobody at that time seemed to really know what's going on. So in the new book, that it will be 2000 to 2010, with obviously a very strong emphasis on the Yangtze River Delta. Now, referring to the one of the previous presentations, there was this notion that maybe it's a diffuse landscape. And yes, it's extremely diffuse, and it's part, if you see in this image, it's part of an entirely diffuse landscape, the size roughly of Germany. I would argue that, in a way, Shanghai, the Yangtze River Delta, is not, even though we did this kind of boring section, 2-hour monotonous section of this particular space from here to here. In reality, Shanghai, I think, is the only truly polycentric city, because it has strong cores and historically had these strong cores. And that kind of almost turned things around. It suggests that, and I think you Beatrice, you were sort of hinting at that maybe it is the hinterland that is nurturing these cities rather than the city sprawling into the hinterland. And that introduces kind of a rather radical new perspective on these mega cities. Now, many other think tanks are trying to understand what's going on. This is the official Chinese take on these so-called clusters. This is McKinsey, a sort of more economic approach. This is my little foundation, and if you overlay them, you get this. So it's extremely arbitrary how you're drawing the circles, what defines a cluster. Our take has been to look at density, and the density in China obviously is in between the cities. It's a bit hard to see. These are screen caps from the new book, so it's not really for consumption on a projector. But you can kind of roughly read that the densities in between the cities reach the point that they are the same as an entire urban field. They have the density of a small American city. That means that China is not all these black dots, but is rather this mega field, and in total 5 others that you can distinguish. That's quite important because, of course, the most sort of productive agricultural land is historically, as we see in the Desert Coast in Indonesia, as we see in the north of India, the most agricultural productive areas are also the most populated, and therefore are expanding, urbanizing the quickest. So they are competing for the same space. So when we started doing the first project, this was kind of triggered by this crazy statement that China made to build 400 new cities. And what we found was rather one megalopolis, if you will, of over 400 million people already in 2005. That was kind of the main message of the first book, and what kind of society that would bring about. And if we could maybe begin to shape, steer that type of landscape. So we cut out the exact, sort of the most densest bubble that megalopolis of 400 plus million people. And of course, as planners, you continue, that's the difference with research. We were always keen to make a difference and to see if our discipline hadn't just been wiped off the map and made redundant. So we tried to imagine, could we use high-speed rail, but also car networks to coalesce, to kind of bulge together the densities in this zone, kind of freeing up the green space. Now, over 10 years later, that seems to kind of has happened, because strangely enough, even though it is a cloud, within that cloud there are still very distinct spikes of density. I think it's kind of overlooked, but some of these spikes are so close together that they operate as one contiguous urban system. So we started investigating, this is another GIS map that we did of what we've been calling Jinghu. That's the train connection between Shanghai and Beijing, because this is Shanghai, of course, this is Beijing, Tianjin, and here's Zhengzhou and Xi'an, so it forms this interesting triangle. Now, this field, you can zoom in further on that square, you can zoom in further, and you see this kind of really almost fractal-like dotted pattern of villages with an almost perfect kind of spread of larger cities, and really introducing the idea of a fractal hierarchy. And when we were looking at sort of the emerging, the city as an emerging entity, you can see the same happening in Italy. There's a lot of Italians here. If you go look at Italy in around 1100 or even a bit earlier, you see that there's a perfect grid of little, not just settlements, but like boroughs or castles that are controlling that patch of agricultural land. So there's an immediate kind of coherence between the amount of productivity of agricultural land and who's controlling it. That is also clear here. If you zoom in on the satellite image, this is the pattern that's revealed, and it allows you to understand how it's possible to create these ridiculous density numbers and these large amounts of people on such a sort of almost invisibly emerging, almost below the radar, emerging between Beijing and Shanghai. I think it was mentioned before, it's clearly not a linear migration from the sort of rural, whatever that is, rural hinterland to the big city. It's this multi-directional migration process. More recently, I've been studying this fabric from another angle. This is 2012, this is the same satellite image 2015, and even though the morphology hasn't changed, and actually these villages haven't changed in the last 20 years, the densities have increased, and crazy, really surprising, now the whole economic drivers behind them are changing. It's becoming a fully industrial or industrialized cityscape. So a village like this, and you can see in roughly in China, the rule is if it's a blue roof, you know it's industry. It doesn't always work at this scale, but by and large. You can see that this village in only a few years' time was able to kind of transform itself to a completely industrialized entity. Here you see very clearly, and these are absolutely all sort of storage and factory facilities, how these kind of spines have emerged. I think that's I can go on, that's the main message, but the real question then, and that's the question I would like to leave for you, and maybe I can get some feedback by email or in other ways, or through you, or in this context, the models we apply now are meaningless. If you build new cities from scratch, or if you expand, or if you kind of do the Beijing thing, which is kind of slicing up your existing fabric and then trying to inbuild. Satellites obviously don't work, and every time you build a satellite image, that's only another starting point for more sort of fragmented expansion. So my very brutal conclusion is that the only model that we are left with as planners is sort of upgrading and densifying, which essentially introduces a radical shift from the traditional kind of discipline, the money-making discipline that we're obviously not following, that is always geared towards eating up more land, building on green sites, versus inward growth, applying urban logic to brownfields. We really have to try and reverse the discipline 180 degrees. Move away from, let's say, models that are intrinsically rigid. Many of the planning models now are rigid. They are literally like this Dutch fortified unit, only now it's of course a residential unit. Here's the image. This is a map that's in the Vatican. One of the earliest maps of Italy is in the Vatican. And you see this kind of perfect kind of spread of these castles. So when this kind of organic growth, and I fully agree that's a bit treacherous to use that term, but if there is indeed this kind of organic growth, this is Chengdu, rather Chongqing, Chengdu, in 19 years of expansion. If that's taking hold of your urbanization process, you kind of have to start letting go of these previous preconceived ideas and trying to see if we can have planning models that work with the city and kind of acknowledge these tentacles that are emerging. The term we coined is quite funny, MUD, as in market-driven, unintentional development. That market-driven aspect is key, of course, because it kind of eludes at planning. It suggests that there is a very distinct intelligence behind it. The Chinese planning machine is the largest in the world. It's hyper-streamlined. It's, dare I say, pooping out new cities as a conveyor belt. And yet, these perfectly slick entities, these sort of individual insular moments, they kind of glue together and morph together if you zoom out, and they're not following the initial planning objectives. There's no way to kind of translate this into a vision. I've been calling it once micro-planned, because these are kind of planned to the last doorknob, right? Morphs into macro-organic, which is quite a, kind of just reveals that strange dynamic. Maybe just stop me at any time. I think that those are the main points. But we tried to formalize that in a model, a very crude model, because we're not scientists. And the model is called dynamic density, and it kind of suggests that in this section there is this traditional density curve which follows, you know, your traditional rent gradient, etc., etc. Is it possible to densify in this part of your traditional rent gradient? It's very difficult because it flies in the face of natural expansion, and it flies in the face of what we believe cities do, which is steadily flatten out. Even if this city grows over time, so let's say this is T1, T2, T3, right? Your village becomes a city, a metropolis. Yes, the densities go up, it gets more compact, but the footprint will always, there is an immediate correlation with the density of the center to the built-up space, the footprint as a whole. And that correlation might be formalized in something like a sort of dynamic density formula. It's a simple idea, but it's interesting for planners because it kind of defies a pervasive model such as the compact city. There's not a document about sustainability you open that doesn't mention the compact city, but the compact city really wants to be this square block, right? It wants to introduce this as a block, and in reality, it seems to me that the dense core and the leveled out suburb are tied to the hip. They are intrinsically bonded. So this perfect square block is a chimera, it's an impossibility. And yet, in Asia, there are some really interesting, let's say, twists that might put you on a different idea. For instance, as we discussed, Yuan, the edges of Beijing can become hyperdense. So the city stops in a hard wall of, you know, towers of 100 plus meters. That hints at a perfect kind of dense, compact city. Now, that might be true, but then we started looking at what's really happening, and we use these silly metaphors. In Beijing, they always talk about the tandabing, which is the spreading pancake, right? Even cab drivers talk about Beijing as the pancake. And that's the reason why everybody's in traffic, and that's the reason of the smog, etc. It's very simplistic, but that's how it's understood. That allowed us to talk about more sort of pastry-related metaphors. For instance, the cake model. What really seems to be going on is that city, as it's expanding, so every object within the urban space is increasing its distance to every other object. And that's rather weird, because there's nothing more static as a building, as a city, right? But it's really happening, because roads are widening. They're introducing very large infrastructural elements where there was very tight-knit urban fabric. So this indeed is like the universe itself, you know, expanding, and the objects are increasing between them. So if that's the case, and then you try to build a satellite, which is now the common practice, the same happens to these cookies. Cookies either don't rise, they're dead, which is the historic situation. There's almost no real successful case of a new town, of a city built from scratch. If it is successful, as in China sometimes it can be, then they begin to kind of be attracted to the core, and they start gluing together, and the advantages of your new town are lost. So what I was trying to suggest in my column just now is, at this point where we are, at least where we are, is not so much further than the urban field begins to deconstruct everything we thought we knew about the city. And that's already a big thing, but I haven't dared going much further. So for instance, if indeed there is an urban density, the density of a city, that stretches all the way from here, from Shanghai to Beijing, that means that within that field, within that space, you can't sprawl. There's no such thing as sprawl. The term is completely meaningless. You can't sprawl within sprawl. Right? So that's the first step that allowed us to begin to pinpoint what was going on. So we started introducing some specific terms. I mentioned one, trans-sprawl, but also monosprawl, infrasprawl, speed sprawl, and policy sprawl. Just as indicators that being so general is really meaningless. We have to start really pinpointing. I think your comments also alluded to that. You have to really pinpoint where exactly it goes wrong. Otherwise, it becomes as gooey as the space itself. No, my last, because I really can, then the book opens up and then you're gone. This is one example I like to share then. For instance, infrasprawl. This is from the previous book, it's old, but we're recycling it because it tells the story rather well. This is Beijing in 2005. These are the ring roads, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. There is no 1 for historic reasons. We used very crude, in those days, now we're getting a bit more sophisticated, but in those days, very, very crude methods to measure the surface area of these ring roads, the tarmac itself. So we just cut it up and kind of stick it together. We use AutoCAD as well, but the point is, if you superimpose all of these, the total surface, only of the ring roads, is already much larger than the historic center of Beijing. So the space, the infrastructural space you're building, consumes more space than it's able to serve. So you're stuck in a sort of catch-22, and that's what we've been calling infrasprawl. It's one example of how there's all these inherent contradictions that this type of urbanization brings with it. Here you see the result. If you take everything out of Beijing and only leave the residential areas, sort of world's largest villa, that's the Forbidden City, the hutongs, the alleyways, almost disappearing. And then towards the second and the third ring, the city falls apart because there's nothing there that holds it together. There is no residential space anymore. If you're talking about panda bears, it's the same. They're eating bamboo, and there's enough of it, but the next patch of bamboo is too far for them to form an ecology, for them to have a biotope that is really able to sustain their lifestyle. And that's the same with the hutong, with the old Beijing lifestyle. If you're living here, you almost can't make your way to your nearest neighbor. You can't have a lifestyle. The city doesn't support it. This is a great moment to stop. My conclusion, sort of the introduction of this book, is no new cities. We should just, as planners, never build new cities ever again. Done. It doesn't make any theoretical sense, but the problem is, from the practical side, in my field as a practitioner, the gap between theory and practice is almost infinite. Nobody's listening to the theoreticians. Nobody's acknowledging these kind of really daunting new facts. Politicians and developers are feeding us projects that we have to take to survive, and yet really defy the reality on the ground. So, then after that I would present projects how we can try incremental change, but that's for next time.
Thank you.
Thanks for the
I have a question.
Please.
So you
Sorry,
want to
the lights on.
intensify what already exists.
Yeah.
So it's like a, do you have a map about or an example about like the visual output of what you mean for intensify what already exists?
So, for instance, this is a map of Shanghai. So we did these, I mentioned we did these GIS maps, right? The pink is 2000, all the pink, at the footprint, and the yellow is 2010. That's an exact duplication. So we actually use this term duplication to describe what's happening across China, because this is the case for the smallest cities, some town in Sichuan, to the biggest metropolitan areas. They have duplicated themselves mainly with industrial sort of sub-districts. Now these are so space intensive, but they are completely underutilized. So there's large tracts of urbanized space that are not used. And that's where we're saying we can really apply sort of new planning procedures.
Can you just be a little more precise about what you mean by duplication? Do you mean like in terms of spatial distance?
No, built-up footprint. So this particular satellite image, or this GIS, was based on a satellite image that kind of had that tracked the change in land use from sort of non-built, that could be agricultural or natural, to built-up space. And when I say duplication, the total, we let the software measure the total surface of pink in 2000, and then yellow in 2010. And that is exactly a duplication in 10 years, even though the world, and me too, we thought China was already slowing down. In reality, it was still very much speeding up. And the peak has been last year, 2015. Mm-hmm. So in 10 years, it simply duplicated its built-up footprint.
Right, okay, yeah. Double the size.
Yeah, and that's almost the case for all the big metropolitan areas. This is it's also very hard to see. This is the Pearl River Delta, which is essentially, this is a very interesting one because in the Pearl River Delta with all the mountains, there is no more space to sprawl to. And that is a kind of a great thing, because what happened, and you see it in the pattern of the yellow, it started to kind of ingrow. It didn't have the room to do this kind of very flamboyant sort of jumping to the suburbs. It had to find the last niches and kind of nooks and crannies. And in that sense, we believe this is almost like an end game. It's almost like a final state where the Pearl River Delta is heading, where it has to become a city of upgrading, densifying, and sort of intensifying.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Okay, you showed us